Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Michael Imber, and I am the board chair of the Connecticut Public Affairs Network. It has almost become cliche that elections have consequences, and every 10 years they really have consequences when we choose our state legislators that redraw our congressional districts based on the national census that we have been talking about for the last few weeks at the Connecticut Democracy Center. Today's discussion is on gerrymandering, and I'd like to introduce our panel moderator, Mark Pasniokis, the Capitol Bureau Chief from the Connecticut Mirror, who will introduce our panel and drive the discussion. Mark?
Good to be with you all. It's too bad that we can't all be together at the old State House, one of my favorite buildings in Connecticut. This would have been a nice place to have this discussion, but video conferencing is something we're all getting familiar with during the pandemic. So let's get going. As Mike said, today's topic is gerrymandering. This concept is as really old as the country. It's the notion of pressing for political advantage by the art and science of how you draw legislative maps, both for Congress and for state legislatures. This, of course, is an activity that has to take place every 10 years once we get our census numbers. And it is something that defies the demographers who insist that demography is destiny. That's not the case based on how you draw maps. And if you have any doubts about that, consider this, that in 2012, Democratic candidates for Congress, I think, outpolled Republicans by 1 million or so votes, but yet Republicans picked up 33 seats. So we'll explore that. So today, our two guests who are going to help explain all this. First is Tom Ross. He is the former president of the University of North Carolina system. He is currently the president of the Volcker Alliance, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit that works on how to make our government more accountable. But more to the point today, he also is the co-chair of North Carolinians for Redistricting Reform. Also with us is Jeff Ladawig. He is a professor of political science at the University of Connecticut. He teaches courses on the U.S. Congress, the presidency, American political parties, among other things. And again, more to the point today, his research includes looking at congressional apportionment, as well as the polarization of politics in Congress and the US. And we'll see how that polarization may be connected to the topic at hand. So Tom, let's start with you with the basics. Explain the gerrymander. Where does that come from? What does it mean? And I think we might have a pretty picture to show at some point. Go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you, and a good day to everybody. So let me just start by a basic point, which I think everybody already knows, and that is every 10 years we do a census. And after that census, we reapportion our elective districts, whether they're local level districts or congressional districts. And the concept of gerrymandering actually goes back many years to one of Connecticut's neighboring states, and that is to Massachusetts. And the definition is actually fairly simple. And I do have a slide, I think, that they can put up that shows a definition of partisan gerrymandering, which is really the key here. And that's when the map drawers, whoever they are dividing a state or county or other political subdivision into election districts. They do it so as to give one political party a majority in as many districts as possible, while concentrating the voting strength of the other party into as few districts as possible. And as I say, this is not a new concept. It started back in Massachusetts with when Governor Gerry actually was criticized, but for a map that he signed into law, and I think we can show a photo of this wonderful district that was drawn, and it was back in the 1800s. And what it shows is the way a district was drawn in Massachusetts by the then existing politician, signed into law by Governor Gerry, was the way he pronounced it. And the newspaper ran this photograph and called it a salamander district. And so the salamander, coupled with Governor Gerry, people forgot how to pronounce his name, ended up with gerrymander. And so we have continued that name for what is really a practice of trying to draw districts in a way that favor one party over another. And I think I can show you one more slide here that in North Carolina, where I'm from, shows that we have not lost the concept of a salamander district. So when that comes up, I think you'll see a district that is the 12th district of North Carolina as it was drawn in 1992. If you look at the one that was drawn in 2011, it's actually very similar. And the goal in 1992, or at least according to the courts, was to pack as many African Americans into one district as possible. And truthfully, that was done in part for partisan reasons, is to favor one party over another. So we do have a long history of gerrymandering in this country, and it became even more frequent after a Supreme Court case, Baker versus Carr, in which we were required then to do reapportionment after every census.
We'll get to the fun stuff, the techniques as well as the consequences. But I think maybe it would help to sort of explore what is your idea? And I'm going to start with Jeff. Let's get him in the conversation. What's your idea of what is a good map? There are competing interests here. He just showed us a map that helped elect, I think, African Americans to Congress, but it also came at a price to other Democrats. And we saw that in Georgia certainly many years ago. But Jeff, what's a good map? Is there a consensus? Anything approaching a consensus on that?
Well, first, thank you very much for having me here. In terms of a consensus, it's tough. I mean, redistricting in many ways is in the eye of the beholder. You know, someone's beautiful map is someone else's, horribly ugly map. And in some ways, it's really, it's hard to tell. So I think it comes down to, we got to figure out what the goals are. And generally speaking, things that we kind of common sense think about in terms of elections, and things that we would generally want, competitive elections, accountability by the representatives, good representation of the constituents. If those things are being generated out of the districts, then in some ways that's by definition then a decent at least district. And as we'll get to the district, for example, that Tom showed, the North Carolina 12th in 1992, in the Supreme Court, that case that first ruled that particular district unconstitutional, Shelby Reno, that case, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor ruled that district unconstitutional primarily because it was bizarre looking. It was oddly shaped. It's not much of a constitutional standard. Nonetheless, that's more or less what we have to go on. There's other metrics, and I'm sure we'll get to some of them, that we can use to evaluate districts, but none of them are conclusive. So it's a difficult subject, and like almost anything in redistricting or in congressional apportionment, it's paradoxical. You try to do one thing and you lessen something else, and there's give and take on almost all the different angles. So it's a very complicated, difficult subject, even though it seems on the face of it pretty straightforward and easy.
I think Justice O'Connor may have been inspired by Potter Stewart and pornography. Tom, what about you? Your organization, one of their goals is to have clear, nonpartisan standards. But I will admit, I have no idea what the hell that means. So what is it? What are you looking for in clear, nonpartisan standards?
I think the issue with gerrymandering is it's always going to be there to a certain extent. I think what we're trying to do, at least in North Carolina, and I think the goal really ought to be everywhere, is to eliminate extreme partisan gerrymandering. And so when we think about a good set of rules that could be applied that would reduce the ability of legislators to gerrymander, certainly, one of the keys for us is that you not be able to consider political data. That is party registration information, voting history information, or really any other kinds of data, that Facebook data, whatever it might be, that can prove to be a proxy for how people vote. And to the extent you can be transparent about what data is used and eliminate the use of political data in drawing the maps, certainly over time, I think you reduce the extreme partisan gerrymandering. There are other factors that we think are important. It's important to keep people that are generally in the same geographic part of a district or state together. So compactness of districts is really important. Try to keep people in the same community, in the same district, because they have similar interests, and at least would like to be represented by someone who understands those interests. So I think there are a number of different factors that one could consider. We have primarily focused on reducing the use of certain kinds of data. I think one of the things that's happened over the last couple of decades with use of computers is the ability to gerrymander has gotten so much better. I remember when I was first involved in this whole issue back in the 80s, people would sit down with legal pads and population data and try to draw maps. Nowadays, and there were rules that prohibited you from breaking down below the precinct level or below the county level. Now you go down to the voting tabulation district, which can be as a few households, and you have algorithms that will drive the outcomes you want. And so being transparent, I think, is a really important part of the process, so people know the data that's being used and know what you're trying to accomplish.
Jeff, do you think that's practical, the idea of setting aside all the political data? My experience in Connecticut, even when they came up with what was generally considered to be a fair congressional map, when Connecticut went from 6 House seats down to 5, but they did so in a very political manner. The idea was to set up a fair fight between a Republican incumbent and a Democratic incumbent. So what's your sense of, is that practical to ever divorce those kind of political considerations from coming up with what in other ways may be a decent map?
Is it practical? I wish, and that is the goal. And that the stuff that Tom is talking about would make a great movement forward in trying to make that so. At the same time, at least as the system is currently, established in Connecticut and a lot of states, it is the politicians that are drawing the maps for themselves, so they have a vested interest in these maps, and it becomes really, really difficult to divorce those two sides of the equation when it's them that are involved in it themselves. In the case where we went down from 6 to 5 districts here in Connecticut. That was Nancy Johnson's ends up winning that and held that seat for I think 2 cycles during the 2000 term, and then lost to Democrat, and that was that seemed in the end, kind of looking back on hindsight, it was held by Republican for a little while, held by Democrat a little while. That seems like a relatively fair balance, where you have the 2 incumbents fighting against each other, and then you get kind of a mixed outcome over the decade. But I think we need to do more than just hope for those things to occur.
So the process, that is set out, it's up to state legislatures. In Connecticut, it's a bipartisan process. It doesn't matter who controls the General Assembly. There are 4 members from each party that sits on the commission, which has its own complications that we can get to a little bit. But in other places, there are independent groups. So, Tom, you've been looking at this for a while. Is there any place that has figured out how to do this?
Well, I think there's been a lot of progress. Let me put it that way. I suspect if you were looking for an example that's worked relatively well for a relatively long period of time, you'd start with Iowa, where they have an advisory commission that draws the maps initially. Legislature's still involved, still has to approve them. but there's some factors in Iowa that make it a little easier probably to do it there. But you've also seen a movement to create independent redistricting commissions in Arizona and California and in some other Western states. And that's really been driven by ballot initiatives, which we don't have. Many states on the East Coast don't have those ballot initiatives. But where the people have basically said, we're tired of the way you've done it in the past, and we want to have an independent commission. There are lots of questions about independent commissions, about how you select them and who sits on them and how much influence the politicians have in selecting them. But I think it does create one step removed from the politicians themselves. And if you have such a commission and they can't use the data that I was talking about earlier, I think you will come out with a better and fair outcome. Further, I think commissions increase public confidence in the process. Certainly in my state, the public, they know this is there's a long history of whoever the party is in control, they draw the districts to suit them. And they don't really care much about the voters. It's about picking the voters that help them, not about letting the voters pick the politicians that can really represent them. So I think a movement toward independent commissions is a good one. It's not a perfect solution. I don't know that there is a perfect solution, but the combination of limiting data usage and an independent commission seems to me to be good progress toward fair, more bipartisan redistricting processes.
Arizona, they had one, and the governor there didn't like the result, and that became an issue. What must happen first? Do you have to build the public case for why this must be done differently? Because as you described earlier, in previous redistrictings, this was really a dark art. It was done with calculators and legal pads, but now, Jeff's students, there's software he can play, and they can come up with districts. And depending what your goal is, you can pretty much do anything. If you want to elect, in the case of Connecticut, if you finally want to elect another Latino to the state Senate, currently there aren't any, you can do that. If you want more black seats, you can do that. If you want more more Democratic and more Republicans, you can do it all. So I guess maybe it's time to talk about, the techniques here. Tom, why don't you tell us about cracking and packing? The two. Go ahead. The two time-honored techniques. Go ahead.
Yeah, they're really the key concepts underlying gerrymandering is cracking and packing, as it's known. And cracking basically takes people who have similar political positions and breaks them into different districts, regardless of what the lines look like, so that you reduce their voting impact. And one of the great examples in North Carolina is we have one of our higher institutions of higher learning, North Carolina A&T State University. Is the largest HBCU, historically black college or university in the country. And this most recent redistricting that we've been through in North Carolina, the dividing line for two congressional seats goes right through the middle of that campus, dividing that campus in half. Clearly designed to crack the African-American community there and and diffuse their ability to vote. Another technique is packing. And so when you saw that district that I showed a few minutes ago, the 12th in North Carolina, that's a really good example of packing minority voters all into one district to ensure that there was a minority member of Congress. But as was mentioned, it by packing all those votes into one district, it certainly did some damage in terms of creating districts that were maybe not as representative of the state at the time. North Carolina is really a very purple state and has been for a long time. But just to show you the effectiveness of cracking and packing, in 2012, I think there were 53% of the votes cast for Congress were cast for a Democrat who was running at the time, if you looked at the total vote. And yet the outcome of the election was 9 Republican members and 4 Democratic members. In 2016, the Republicans cast a few more votes than Democrats, like 52-48, and the outcome was 10 Republican seats and 3 Democratic seats. So I think I have a slide somewhere that shows a process, the outcome of a process we used, which was to get a group of retired judges, mostly former Supreme Court justices, to sort of do a simulation model of what it would look like if you used an independent commission and didn't use political data. And you can see this was the outcome that they came up with, which is actually creates compact districts. And if you do the political analysis of this outcome, it came out 6 seats that would favor or lean Republican, 5 seats that would lean Democrat, and the remaining 2 seats would be toss-ups, and much more reflective, I think, of where the politics of North Carolina are in today's world. So I think it is possible to do this in ways that create fair districts that are a bit more competitive, but also, that's another point I should make, is in the maps that were drawn by the Republican legislature in our state, of the elections that occurred in 2018, every single winner got at least 58% of the vote, and 11 of the 13 members of Congress got 60% or higher. And you know, that's reflective of landslides in a state that right now is a dead heat in the presidential election, as well as in our senatorial election. So gerrymandering can be a powerful, powerful tool used by the party in power.
You know, when you talk about that concentration, the landslides, I guess we need to talk about what are the consequences of that. You know, red districts get redder, blue districts get bluer. Jeff, you've written about the polarization of American politics, and I don't think you're going to argue that redistricting is the sole cause of that. But how does it contribute? What happens in these districts? You know, if the fight, I guess, shifts to nominations as opposed to the general election.
So, I mean, again, it's a complicated story, I think. On the face of it, what we would tend to see is that when politicians are drawing these maps for their, you know, for the benefit of their party, what they tend to want to do is to maximize the number of partisans that get elected. They're not looking for necessarily for ideological purity within a district, because that would be, to do so would be essentially to be packing their own constituents, their own partisan constituents into a district, and thus not being able to elect as many members to the state legislature or to the U.S. Congress. So generally speaking, the party that's in charge, if they're really going to try to maximize their gerrymander, they'll put about 55-60% of their own party constituents within a district, and then be able to spread those out to other districts so that they can maximize, again, the number of partisans that get elected. On the face of it, like kind of the general straightforward political science literature would tend to say that that would lessen polarization. But that's not what we've seen. I have one slide up in terms of polarization, slide 8. If you want to take a look at this, what we've seen over the years is a really sharp increase in terms of polarization in the U.S. Congress. The blue thick line, solid line, is for the House of Representatives. The red dotted line is for the Senate. So since the mid to late 1970s, we see this dramatic rise to almost record levels of polarization in Congress. A couple things to note from here is that both the House and the Senate are rising. And the Senate, of course, never gets redistricted. It's on state lines. So clearly redistricting isn't the whole problem here, of course. But there is that, you know, gap between the House and the Senate. And so that could be constituents differences, but it could also in part probably be some part of redistricting. Political science hasn't been able to really flesh this out terribly well yet. I think that's a pretty big mission, is to figure out the number of mechanisms between the two that would cause that. And some ideas on that is certainly that the greater emphasis on the primaries, and that with as the I think it's the most recent Supreme Court decision on the North Carolina districts called that had labeled or described the process of creating the districts as with surgical precision. And that's what, as Tom was saying, with the big data that's available now and the computing power, if you cut your districts at 55 to 60%, you can not only know which partisans are in there, but how intense they are. So you can almost guarantee your reelection even at those thinner margins with all the better data and computing power that's out there, which means that everything is the election is really shifted from the general election back to the primary. The only thing that partisans then are worried about is being, Democrats would be, outflanked on their left, or Republicans outflanked on their right in the primary elections. And this then causes both parties to kind of go more to the extremes and increases possibly increases polarization. I've written actually on how and shown statistically how the rising margins in these congressional races, as Tom was talking about, is a contributor to polarization. I didn't connect that directly to redistricting, but I see a pretty clear case where that could be made.
There are competing interests here. When you look at what people are trying to achieve, it really is a daunting list. We have geographic compactness. You want sort of communities of interest to sort of hang together. But you also have a desire to make sure that the diverse populations are adequately represented. And, so that certainly gets you to be sensitive to racial diversity. So, Jeff, your class is played with some of this software. So talk a little bit about, again, these competing interests. And if you want to draw a district, that, again, makes it possible for a Latino politician to be elected in, say, Greater Hartford, which historically has a huge Puerto Rican population, but yet has never been able to elect a state senator because Hartford is divided in half and also attached to one district to the northern suburbs and one to the southern suburbs. So tell us a little bit about that exercise you had your students do.
Yeah, so it's a class I've been teaching for about a decade, Political Science 3603 WQ. So if you're interested, you know where to go. And so in conjunction with the State Data Center, we put together a website that uses the data that is publicly available on voter registration, on vote choice, on demographic variables, whites, Hispanics, blacks, gender, income, all these different variables. And essentially what I do each semester when I teach this class is break up the students in groups and then give them kind of different assignments. See how many Republicans you can get elected, how many majority minority districts you can create in Connecticut. And I give them the basic legal rules. You got to have contiguity. The districts must all be connected and touching each other. And you must we abide by town lines. That's the only requirements I have. So these would be ostensibly legal districts. And then I say, be creative, go nuts. And every semester, I'm amazed. These really creative students come out with these. Just crazy, awful maps. And at least for the purposes of this class, the more awful they are, they more interested, everyone is in them, because they demonstrate just how many different varieties, and essentially an infinite variety of combinations to create, and to achieve these different goals. But you got to really, to do this, you got to engage in some extreme gerrymandering. And these districts, when we measure them on these kind of some of these metrics that we use in terms of measuring gerrymandering, they're awful. They're absolutely awful. And I don't think the public would ever look at any of these maps and say, that's what I want. But it just goes to show in an extreme sense, what can be done, and in some ways, what has been done.
Tom, what's your view on the value of being a little bit creative to have as many competitive districts as possible, even if that does mean a little bit of cracking? And what I mean, certainly our cities tend to have a concentration of Democratic voters. So, these maps are not just a function of political mischief, but it's also a function of settlement patterns, historical settlement patterns. But what do you think about maybe getting a little aggressive, trying to reach into the cities to make more congressional districts competitive?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question, and really is one of the places where there is a sort of a conflict between different principles. So if competitiveness was a driving force, then I think you would see an element of cracking and packing in a way that would try to design districts that are the most competitive. My own view of that is that if you eliminate the use of partisan data, particularly if you have an independent commission, some of that happens naturally, but you also have to be careful, I think, not to disrupt compactness and communities of interest too much. So let me, again, just refer to my own state in North Carolina, because I think it is a little bit, it's a good example. So the metropolitan areas in North Carolina, the Raleigh-Durham Research Triangle area, the Triad area, which is Greensboro, Winston-Salem, and the Mecklenburg-Charlotte area, those areas are increasingly voting blue. But if you look at the rural parts of our state, they are much redder. And I think, the issue you run into is if you start cracking the rural districts or the urban districts to try to create more competitive seats, you end up disrupting the communities of interest and the compactness. And so I think I have a slide of the 2011 Congressional Map, which I actually think is a pretty good display of sort of how this can be done. And so again, you see some districts that wander all over everywhere, or have tentacles that are reaching out into different parts of the state. And those were done, and part of it is if you look at you folks may not all know North Carolina geography really well, but if you look around the Research Triangle area, and even more so around the Triad area, you'll have 3 or 4 congressional districts all being part of that metropolitan area. And that does disrupt, I think, the sense that people have a representative that really understands who they are and what their issues are. So it's a tough balance. I think there are ways to do it that I think are fair to the voters, and competitiveness certainly is a reasonable factor, because I think, just to go back to the issues of consequences a minute, I completely agree with Jeff. And it's, I don't know, we have great research, but I think anecdotally we can figure out pretty quickly that as we've pushed the parties more to the extreme, their incentive to compromise and to actually solve problems is reduced. Because if they start reaching across the aisle, they're going to get what we call primary. That is, they're going to be attacked from their flank, whether on the left or right. And what we really need is politicians that are responsible to all of the voters in their district, not just the partisans, so that they have to reach out and compromise and solve problems, because that's what I think most voters want to see, is solutions to the problems they're facing.
I should mention at this point, we do have a chat function, and if people have questions, they can use that function, and maybe we can work this into the conversation. So both of you, we talked a little bit about the courts, but what's the current state of play? What are the clear no-nos? And what's the stuff that's still kind of unresolved?
I'm going to let Jeff start with that one.
I was going to let the judge start. Please take over.
Well, I mean, I think the basically where we are, at least in my opinion, is the United States Supreme Court in the last year basically walked away from redistricting. Basically said it was a political question, which is interesting in my view. I think you could make a case that Baker versus Carr could have been considered a political issue too, but it wasn't. And I do think there's a question of basic fairness and equal protection here that the court overlooked. But regardless of that, they've made their decision. And so what's happened since, and it happened in Pennsylvania actually before the U.S. Supreme Court decision, but it's happened in North Carolina and other states after that, is the state courts using state constitutions have now intervened. Certainly in North Carolina, that's what happened. They intervened and indicated both our congressional districts and our legislative districts were unconstitutional under the state constitution and required redrawing of those districts. And so I think that's where the action is going to be in the future is in state courts. In those states that are still that were covered initially by the Voting Rights Act, and North Carolina is one of those, there are rules around racial gerrymandering that are still in place. And so there are limitations on how you can redraw districts that impact the minority voting stream. So there are rules out there. States generally have some rules in there, either constitution or legislation, that relate sometimes to districts have to be contiguous. We have that rule in North Carolina, and that famous 1992 district was at one point was really only connected by the median of an interstate. And so, contiguous districts can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, but, I do think there are some rules in place that have to be followed, but the action in the courts is going to be in the states, in my view.
What was the basis for deciding that those were unconstitutional? Was that on a state constitutional requirement about contiguous? Okay.
Yeah. Right. Well, no, it was not based on there being not being contiguous. It was based on equal protection arguments under our state constitution and the basic right to vote. And so our constitution is a little different than the U.S. Constitution, and I think that was the basis that the court used in order to rule them unconstitutional.
So in Connecticut, courts have been really reluctant to get involved in this stuff. And even though there is sort of a deadlock set up, so we mentioned the map that was drawn after the 2000 census. And because that was considered to be a politically competitive map, when the legislature deadlocks 4-4 and they have trouble finding somebody who's truly independent to be a tiebreaker. So instead it goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court's default last time was, well, that map was basically okay, so do the least changes possible to that map. So as a result, Connecticut stuck with a congressional map that is not as creative as we see in North Carolina or in certainly other places where some of these districts have very colorful names. I think Maryland has one called the Pinwheel of Death. My personal favorite is in Pennsylvania, where I think there's one described as it's either Mickey Mouse or Donald Duck. And I think Donald Duck kicking Goofy in the groin. That was creative. But in Connecticut, we have a little bit of two claws reaching between the 1st and 5th districts. So, Jeff, are we stuck? There you go. There's the map. So are we stuck with this map until Connecticut loses a seat, which nobody expects is going to happen in this census, but probably 10 years out? So are we stuck with this, given the court's unwillingness to really say, all right, boys and girls, get serious and draw a map that makes more sense?
Well, it obviously depends, first of all, on the legislature, and if they can get together and or one side wins so handily in this upcoming election that they can redraw the map to their own preferences. But barring that, then it'll probably go back to the courts, and then the courts, as they said in 2010, is essentially do as little harm as possible, like you had mentioned. Just to point out a couple things, in terms of interesting names and whatnot. I make my students name all their districts, and so they come up with some really great names, and many of them I probably shouldn't say here. But if you put up slide number 5, I mean, one thing that I think is interesting about just kind of thinking about the history of redistricting in the United States, that incredibly inflammatory district that Eldridge Gerry created back in 1812, that inflamed the passions at the times and created, the very portable name of gerrymandering itself. If you just inverse it, it looks pretty much like our first district here in Connecticut, and no one blinks an eye at the first district of Connecticut in terms of gerrymandering. That's how kind of accustomed, I think, or used to the process we've gotten, and how much more extreme cases there are out there. We have, I mean, one of my most, couple favorite districts, I don't know if people have these or not, is in the 2000 cycle in Arizona, for example. There was a district on the western side of the state, all the way down from the suburbs of Phoenix, all the way up to the very top of the border. But then it ran down the Colorado River, through the Grand Canyon, across the Navajo Indian territories into the Hopi Indian territories, and then captured that center of kind of a donut-shaped area to incorporate, both the suburbs of Phoenix, the Grand Canyon area, the river, and the Hopi Indian Reservation. And they did it because there was federal disputes between the Navajo and the Hopi at the time, and they thought different congressional districts would be appropriate to represent that. Now, so that is an incredibly gerrymandered district, but maybe that was a good thing to do that. It wasn't based on partisanship at all. So again, I think we need to look at a lot of different criteria, and as Tom has argued, taking the partisan data out of there, would help. Would help a lot in drawing this, maintaining these districts. Another slide, just real quick. If you look at slide number 2, one of the aspects in that the judge had told the redistrictor, Nate Priscilli, who redrew our districts in 2010, is to maintain our communities of interest. And in Connecticut, we define those as towns. So there was only 5 towns that were divided into different congressional districts. And that's, so that's, again, maybe something that we value, that towns across the state are basically all intact in terms of their congressional districts. That doesn't mean that gerrymandering can't happen. Again, I make my students draw all their maps with intact towns, and you can get to some pretty weird results. But that's where we are with Connecticut, I guess.
Well, and in Connecticut, it actually won't matter how big a margin, because Democrats are going to retain a majority, but it really doesn't matter how many seats they win, because the process itself is it's bipartisan. It's equal membership on that commission. Yeah, which is why it defaults. But where it does make a difference historically, and this goes to something Tom mentioned earlier, and I think you did as well, and that is this tendency, it's a very human tendency, in the states where legislative leaders are drawing the maps. They look at their members. They look at who they're trying to help, who they'd like to get rid of, who can handle a more competitive district. Right. And so, yes, you do see the results shaping it that way. Tom, how do we get rid of that? I mean, that's a very natural human thing, right? You're looking at, you tend to look at, the politicians tend to look at these maps in terms of today, of who holds the seats. Although I will say in Connecticut, we're seeing certainly a shift in some Democratic areas that are going red, and some Republican areas, particularly in Fairfield County, going blue in a fairly dramatic way. But I guess, so what's wrong with sort of having that part of the process, and how do you fix it?
Well, people have different views about whether incumbency should be considered. Some think it's okay, and others don't. I think probably the safest and best way to eliminate it is if you had some sort of commission drawing the maps, and they weren't allowed to consider the political data, but neither are they allowed to consider the residence of incumbents. And there are certainly rules in some states where you cannot consider the addresses or locations of incumbents. So it makes it harder to draw districts that are safe for them, and more likely that they will just be part of the overall process. And some might come out winners, some might come out losers, but you're not drawing districts specifically to protect people. But again, in a state like North Carolina, where the legislature, whoever's in control of the legislature, decides the districts, they definitely consider incumbency, and even to the point where within their own party, if there's somebody they don't really like that hadn't been loyal or whatever, they'll draw them right out into a district that they can't win. So it does happen. There's a technique that's been used often, which is double bunking. That is where there's a member maybe of the other party you want to get rid of. You put them in a district with an existing incumbent in your party, in a district that's more likely to lean toward your party, and you can eliminate that person so that the other seat is an open seat, and you're more likely to pick it up. And so double bunking is a fairly normal process that partisans use in redistricting. And so I think the better way is just to exclude the use of incumbent information about where they live.
I don't want to go too far afield, but I think we have to talk a little bit about money in politics. And states like North Carolina, where it is the legislature and it's sort of winner take all, these become very attractive targets for independent expenditure groups. And under Citizens United, there's no limit on the spending. Tom, there was a lot of outside spending to flip seats in North Carolina. In addition to the ability to draw maps to help squeeze out a few more Republican members of Congress, what's been the impact on North Carolina politics?
Yeah, well, I think it's changed it completely. I can remember, when I first got involved in politics, the North Carolina General Assembly, if you wanted to run for a seat in the North Carolina General Assembly, you'd be a big spender if you spent $100,000. Now it's millions of dollars coming in from outside groups in some seats in order to try to control the legislature. This started, I think, in maybe most directly, the Republican Party back years ago developed what they call the Red State Project, and they started pushing the election of their candidates at the local level, and they intentionally tried to target legislatures to get control of legislatures so they could control redistricting. The Democrats are now doing exactly the same thing. Former Attorney General Eric Holder leads a group that's a partisan group trying to capture state legislatures in order to be able to control the redistricting process. Because if you control that, you do in fact control how many members of Congress come from your state. And just to give you an example of how quickly things can change, as I said, in the 2018 election, the outcome was 10-3. In the 2020 election, we're going to see, but I suspect everybody agrees that there will be at least 2 and maybe as many as 4 seats that will flip red to blue because of the court-ordered redistricting. So, this gerrymandering is a political tool that has become a science and definitely is utilized in ways that can end up in the control of the state, but also the control of Congress. And so it is ripe for big money. It has led to lots and lots of money pouring into races on both sides. Just for example, in the congressional district number 8 in North Carolina, it's apparently, according to the polls, a pretty close election. It's held by a Republican now. The person running against him is an African-American former member of the state Supreme Court. It's supposedly a close election, and an outside group supporting the incumbent just put $2 million into the race just last week, $2 million additional dollars in just last week. So there's a lot of money pouring in to try to control the outcome here.
I'll plug actually somebody's book. If somebody's really interested in the role of money and how smart, quite frankly, the Republicans were in sort of resisting the demographic trends. There's a book by a guy named Dave Daly, former colleague in Connecticut, a couple of places I've worked. The title of the book, unfortunately, I don't think I'm going to share. It's part of the title is Rat, and the second part of it is I think what we would call an F-bomb. But you can look it up. I don't know if that's part of your syllabus, Professor, is it?
It is not. It's a great book, but it's not part of my syllabus.
All right. What about this business of seats where there's no opposition, whether it's no realistic opposition, or in the case of the Connecticut General Assembly this cycle, there's I think 26, 27 House seats that there's no opposition whatsoever. The 4 of the Senate districts, there's only one candidate running. This is a question for the both of you. What's your sense of how much of that is a function of redistricting mischief as opposed to just, again, settlement patterns, where, if you're in New York City, you may have a primary opponent, but you're probably going to be pretty safe in the general. So go ahead. Tom, you want to take that first?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think there are some districts in our state that are clearly going to be safe regardless of gerrymandering because of the way people have settled and the way they tend to vote. But it's pretty easy to see the impact of gerrymandering because, again, our courts have ordered redrawings, and you're going to see both legislative and congressional seats, I think, that are going to be more of them are being contested this time. There were, back after 2011, there were very, very few seats in our General Assembly that really were possible for the party out of power to win. But now there are a much larger number of competitive districts. And so we saw the last time the Democrats picked up a few, and I think, it'll depend on the outcome of this election, but you're going to see some seats move around because there are more competitive. And the reason they are is because the amount of gerrymandering has been lessened as a result of court orders.
Jeff, any thoughts on Connecticut as to why we have so many seats that go unchallenged?
It's certainly, I think, part of it is gerrymandering, absolutely. And the incumbency advantage that is taken by that is very real, and it makes it hard then for challengers to come in and think that they might have a shot at actually winning. And add on top of that, like you were saying, the money issue. Not only would it be daunting just in terms of maybe the partisanship of a district, but add on top of that the costs that it would take to mount a credible challenge is, it's really tough. So the combination of issues makes becoming a challenger more and more difficult. And, that's not good for either party. It's not good for the citizens or for representation. The competition helps.
So when it comes to taking an issue and getting the public interested, quite often it requires some event, a little scandal, what have you. Tom, in North Carolina, what was the impetus for your reform group? Was there any single race that really just was beyond the pale, any map that really offended people? How is it that you got a reform group focused on what, is very important, but can be a fairly esoteric exercise on how we draw maps?
Well, I think what happened in our state was 4 out of the last 5 decades, our state has been in litigation over redistricting from the beginning of the decade till the end. And then we start all over again. And I think people have been very frustrated by that, in both parties. I think the other thing that's happened is historically, the Democrats were very good at gerrymandering when they were in control, and the Republicans have been very good at it now that they've been in control for the last 10 years. And so I think there were a number of people in both parties that said, look, this is really become a problem for our democracy. It's become a problem for our state to continue to make progress because of the sort of polarization and extreme nature of the people that are getting elected. And so we actually started with bringing together a group of politically active people from both parties and talking about this issue and trying to get them interested in supporting some reform. And actually it was pretty easy to get people on board. And we raised north of $2 million to try to create public awareness of the importance of the issue. And, we were certainly helped in that by the constant litigation and the publicity surrounding that. But I think the awareness about this issue in North Carolina is at a much, much higher level than it was before we started I guess it was early 2017 when we got started.
Well, I think that's probably a good spot to end it. I want to thank you both for a quick hour of something that is, again, it can be esoteric, but it also it's fun. I mean, there's a lot of tricks to this trade. I think Mike Imber wants to come back on and talk a little bit about what is next in this program series that Connecticut Public Affairs Network is doing. I think Mike is muted.
Yeah, I think he is.
I can.
There we go.
Hey,
Technical problem solved.
COVID, if somebody was not unmuted.
That's exactly right. You'll have yourself tested if your hearing isn't. I'd like to thank Jeff and Tom and our moderator, Mark, for a fantastic panel discussion today. It's a beautiful capstone for the Census series that was sponsored by Connecticut Humanities. Thank them. I'd like to thank our behind-the-scenes producer, Kobe O'Connell, did a phenomenal job. And I'd also like to plug some upcoming events. Tomorrow at noon, we have a program entitled The Ballot is Stronger Than the Bullet, A Short History of Voting. On Thursday, November 19th, we've got an event called A Clean Slate, Clearing Room for the Complete Story of Crandall's Canterbury School. That's going to be a fascinating discussion about African-American women and the discrimination against them, and how the Crandall School was the very first of its kind to admit African-American girls for a better education. On Monday, November 30th at 3 p.m., Legislative Landmarks, the American School for the Deaf. I'm Mike Imber, Chairman of the Connecticut Public Affairs Network. I thank you for tuning in and look forward to you coming back and learning some more at the Connecticut Democracy Center. Thank you.
thank you.